Maybe it's just me, but I think it's time to bring great textbooks back into the classroom. I know that statement brings my age, and I know back in the days I always learned better with textbooks. And I do know that nowadays it's 2024 and we have the technology to bring resources in the classroom. The reason why I mentioned that is that in the last maybe a couple days, maybe 6 or 7 students came to me and they wanted to have either access to textbooks, or I was talking to students and I was helping one actually yesterday where there was no textbooks available and the person was struggling quite a bit. And therefore, a textbook would be great for that person. Now, keep in mind that nowadays with electronics, it's cheaper probably to use technology. If you think of textbooks, they're expensive. They're several hundreds of dollars for some per copy, and I know it's not always good. And on top of that, I know that some of those textbooks, they are sometimes edited or they have new edition, maybe every 5, sometimes 10. If you think of the current science curriculum in Ontario, it was published in 2008. So that means that the textbooks for the grade 10, 11, and 12 right now have been published in 2008 and 2009. So that's a long time ago for science textbooks. Anyway, this is the topic I want to share with you today. I'm going to share this podcast in 3 parts. First part will be about the learner's perspective, second about the teacher's perspective, and then we'll see if we can add the leader's perspective afterwards. So with respect to the learner's perspective, a learner wants to learn. So if they go in a classroom, teachers are amazing. They share resources of all kinds. On the net, in person, there's collaboration. People are getting up. There's debate. They're discussing. There's different activities they can do to get the information together. And learning happens. You have to keep in mind that learners tend to learn regardless of how the setting is, because often people want to get better at what they do. So with respect to resources, what I've noticed is that when there are less textbooks available, what happens is that students are relying a lot on teacher resources and then on the internet resources. Teacher resources are amazing because they're made with a teacher, but sometimes it's not as organized as it could be. Second, if you think of resources from, okay, I lost my train of thought. So I said it was, it's funny how it is. It is the first one will be the resources from teachers, and then I forget the other one. If they have resources such as textbooks, then they can become more independent. They can be more independent because they know where resources can be. And the other point was the internet. Nowadays, students use the internet. However, knowing that the AI is an important part of life right now, and knowing that AI is creating content on the internet, and sometimes we can debate on how great this content is, I do believe that in some ways, textbooks have their value. And the reason for that is if you keep in mind that if there's an editor, a company wants to create a textbook, they have a team of writers. Once the team of writers put it together, there's an editor putting the information together, making sure it's good. There are some reviews on the textbooks, correction. So what happens is that it does take time. It does take resources and money. I do understand that. However, I think it has an amazing opportunity for students to learn independently. I know that I was like that because I love to be in a classroom to learn with my peers, but I always love to have something where I could read at my own pace and refer to if I wanted to. Because if you keep in mind that a learner in a classroom is interpreting the information from a teacher, and that teacher interpreted the information on their side as well. So there's a lot of interpretation there. The same way if you have something from the internet, something from a textbook, the whole idea here is how we can interpret each other's resources and information to have a good understanding. But sometimes if resources are not readily available, or we cannot put our hands easily on those resources, it's tricky. Then again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, that's my perspective. I grew up with textbooks and maybe I'm biased that way. But I do believe that there's good value for students to be able to have access to a textbook where they can, at their own pace, learn the way they want. So I think that's the first part, to think that it is interesting. Now, I do know that resources come from different places. Teachers have been great content creators. I create content and it's amazing. However, I think it would be interesting to see if we can find a way to find resources in one place. That would be great. I know a couple of years ago, I was looking at there's a K-12 organization in the United States that create digital textbooks, and that is a great resource. I'll see if I can find the link, and I'll put it in the description when I edit this video. So that's something to look into. Let's go for the second aspect of this podcast, about a teacher's perspective. Now, I do know that if a teacher, especially new teachers, they want to have resources to teach their class, a textbook is often easier. Nowadays, we have drives full of information, lessons. We share with each other the information. So the wealth of information is there tremendously. However, I believe that if you have a chance to put your hands on several textbooks, you have a chance to learn different perspective and have different ideas put together. So you're merging information, and then you're creating what you love. I do know that some people will say, well, textbooks, as soon as they're edited, they're obsolete. And I do know that for some topics, that can be true. Even though if you think of literature, people are reading literature that have been published for the last few decades, last centuries, and it's still working. In science, there's some topics that don't change that much either. And I was thinking of a story as well. When I was in university, I took a physics course. It was classical physics, and we had the blue textbooks. I just remember that it was expensive. Back in the days, I was paying $50 for a credit at McGill probably in 1989. And guess what? The textbook was like twice as expensive as my credit at university. And on top of that, my professor at the time was teaching with the textbook. But when he was telling jokes to the class, he was even using the jokes from the textbook. So at that point, you can see that some teachers, when they start, they may rely sometimes too heavily on a textbook. But resources are important. And the other part too is that if a teacher comes in, a new teacher, and they have resources on the topics to share with the students, sometimes reading a textbook, reading information gives a better depth of understanding on the topics. Then again, I want to share that this is my opinion based on my experience, and I'm not saying that this is what needs to happen. I'm just talking out loud on these ideas. Now, I remember when a long time ago, maybe in the years 2000, I remember that I wanted to write textbooks because it is something that I do love, and I do believe that there's values to that. I see it with students. When I ask them to share information verbally, they are amazing because we're doing so much more verbal interactions in the classroom. However, I've noticed as well that students are reading less and less, especially in sciences, in my science class in grade 9 and 10. And reading less gives less opportunities for the students to learn a language, to learn new vocabulary. So instead of learning vocabulary on a list of vocabulary words, they see vocabulary words within context. And I think there's value for that. Now, you have to say that English is my second language. That means that I learn through listening to the information, but I also learn vocabulary for English, especially through reading as well. Because I do believe that hearing the information, seeing the information is important, the same way that you need to speak and you need to create information by writing reports or whatever. So that's something that is interesting, because in the past, I used to ask students to either present reports from a lab, or so either present or write a report. And what happens is that in the past, often they like to write the report. Very few wanted to share the information. And as the years are progressing, I noticed that there's less and less people wanting to write their report, and more want to verbally talk about their learning, which for me works very well. But I think there's still values on reading and writing in order to put our thoughts together to make it work. Because back in the days when I was doing lab reports, I had a template, a list of the information to include in the lab report. And students were following the process, the list of things that they needed to add, and that's what they did. Nowadays, I do have it's like a worksheet where I have spaces and little blocks for all the parts they need to do. So they don't have to think at the whole part. They just do one bit at a time. Doesn't mean it's bad, but it's a bit different. And I do believe that reading has its place as well. For the third part here, related to the leader's perspective, I don't know what's the best solution here. And I would love to hear your comments. Read your comments in the section below to see what are your thoughts on having textbooks or not, or what is the best way to learn. I know nowadays more and more people are using podcasts, more and more people are using AI to summarize information. And is there a need for textbook? That's a great question. And as I mentioned, maybe this topic today has no place in the as a podcast in 2024, but I do believe that for some learners, having written resources makes a difference in many ways. Anyway, these are my thoughts. Hopefully, you can appreciate. If you have any clarification questions, comments, you think that no textbooks ought to be out of classrooms, or if you think that textbooks need to be in the classroom, I would love to hear your perspective. On this, have an amazing day, and I will see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.